The dust of Redemption Creek settled on Eleanor Vance like a shroud. It coated her sensible, albeit worn, traveling dress, clung to the single battered valise at her side, and settled in the creases of her heart. She'd arrived with a hope as bright and fragile as the lace on a wedding gown, a hope that now felt as distant as the eastern horizon she'd traveled from. The train, a puffing, wheezing dragon of iron and steam, had deposited her here in this parched, sun-baked expanse, and then chugged away, leaving her utterly alone. Her reflection in the grimy window of the stationmaster's office showed a face too pale, too gaunt for the relentless glare of the afternoon sun. Her eyes, once a lively hazel, were now shadowed with a weariness that went bone deep. A month ago, she'd been Eleanor Fairchild, a woman on the cusp of a new life, a life promised to her by a man with a smile as smooth as polished oak and a reputation as solid as the granite mountains that framed their distant hometown. A man named Thomas Blackwood. The ceremony was to have taken place in the modest but charming chapel in Willow Creek. She'd pictured it 1,000 times, the organ's gentle swell, her father's proud hand on her arm, Thomas's earnest gaze as she walked down the aisle. But Thomas Blackwood, it turned out, had a reputation for being as solid as quicksand. He'd never shown up. No note, no word, no explanation. Just an echoing silence that had followed her, amplified by the cruel whispers and pitying glances of the townsfolk in Willow Creek. Her father, a man whose pride had always been his bedrock, had been devastated, his own reputation tarnished by his daughter's public humiliation. It was he, in his shame and a desperate attempt to shield her from further scorn, who had arranged for her passage to Redemption Creek. "Heard you were headed west, missy," the station master, a man whose beard seemed to have more grey than his hair, rasped, not unkindly. "Redemption Creek ain't much, but it's a place to start over, they say." Eleanor managed a weak nod, her throat tight. "A place to start over," she echoed, the words tasting like ash. She clutched her valise tighter. Inside were the remnants of her former life, a few serviceable dresses, a worn Bible, and a small, tarnished silver locket containing a miniature portrait of her parents. Thomas's gifts, his letters, she'd burned them all before leaving. There was no space for ghosts in the life she intended to build. As she stepped out of the station, the full force of Redemption Creek hit her. It wasn't a town. It was a collection of weathered wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the immense, indifferent sky. A general store, a blacksmith's, a livery stable, and, at the heart of it all, a sprawling, gaudy building with a swinging door that promised, or perhaps threatened, oblivion, the Rusty Spur Saloon. The air hummed with a low, guttural murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of raucous laughter. It was a world away from the quiet, respectable streets she knew. She clutched the crumpled piece of paper with the address of the boarding house her father had found for her. Mrs. Gables. It sounded respectable, safe. As she walked, her sensible boots kicking up dust, a group of men lounging outside the saloon's entrance eyed her with a blatant curiosity that made her skin crawl. Their stares lingered, stripping away any semblance of privacy, any shred of dignity she might have clung to. One of them, a burly man with a thick, greased mustache, let out a low whistle. "Well, looky here, boys. What kind of bird flew into our nest?" he slurred, his eyes leering. Eleanor's cheeks flushed hot. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was no bird. She was a woman who had been discarded, a woman who had nowhere else to go. The whispers followed her like persistent flies. "New in town. Looks like trouble. Or maybe she's looking for it." She reached the boarding house, a 2-story structure that, while plain, offered a sense of solidity. The sign read, "Mrs. Gables Boarding House, clean rooms, honest prices." Eleanor hoped it was more than just a sign. As she climbed the creaking steps, she took a deep breath, trying to push away the lingering scent of the saloon and the even more potent scent of her own fear. Redemption Creek. She prayed it would live up to its name. Mrs. Gable was a woman carved from oak, sturdy and unyielding, with eyes that missed nothing. Her welcome was as brisk as the dry desert air, efficient and devoid of any effusive warmth. Rooms on the second floor. Second door on the left. Water's in the pitcher. Dinner's at 6 sharp. No loud noises after 10. Her words were a series of pronouncements, establishing the unwritten rules of her domain. Eleanor, grateful for the semblance of order, nodded mutely. The room was small, sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a rickety wooden dresser, and a wash basin. The wallpaper, a faded floral print, peeled in places, but the sheets were clean, and a sliver of sunlight softened by the dusty window pane offered a small measure of comfort. It was a far cry from the home she'd lost, but it was a start, a place to lay her head, a sanctuary from the judgmental eyes of the town. She unpacked her few belongings, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. The dresses were simple, practical. She had no need for finery in Redemption Creek. She carefully placed the locket on the dresser, its silver gleam a faint echo of brighter days. The Bible, too, she set aside. She wasn't sure if she believed in salvation anymore, but perhaps there was solace in its familiar words. As she dressed for dinner, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the dresser's warped mirror. The paleness was still there, the shadows under her eyes, but something else had begun to surface. A flicker of defiance. The humiliation of Willow Creek, the abandonment by Thomas, the leering stares in the street. They had chipped away at her, but they hadn't shattered her. Not entirely. A quiet anger began to simmer beneath the surface, a silent promise to herself that she would not be defined by her misfortune. Dinner was a silent affair, punctuated only by the clatter of silverware and Mrs. Gable's occasional sharp pronouncements on the virtues of punctuality and cleanliness. The other boarders were a mix of taciturn men, ranchers, a prospector, a quiet fellow who introduced himself as a traveling salesman. They ate with a focused intensity, their gazes rarely meeting, their words even rarer. Eleanor felt like an intruder, a misplaced flower in a field of hardy prairie grass. After dinner, unable to face the quiet solitude of her room just yet, Eleanor ventured downstairs. The common room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows. A few of the boarders sat in various states of repose, reading newspapers or mending clothes. The air was thick with the scent of lamp oil and stale tobacco. She found a quiet corner and picked up a worn copy of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn from a small stack of books. She needed to lose herself to escape the immediate reality of Redemption Creek. But her mind, unbidden, kept drifting back to the saloon. The raucous laughter, the men's unsettling stares. She knew with a chilling certainty that the saloon was the heart of this town, and its pulse beat with a rhythm she found deeply unsettling. Suddenly, the swinging doors of the saloon, visible across the dusty street, burst open, and a wave of noise spilled out, a drunken shout followed by a roar of laughter. A man stumbled out, his arms flailing, and collapsed onto the boardwalk. A moment later, 2 other men emerged, dragging him back inside. The scene, stark and brutal under the gaslight, sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. This was the underbelly of the West, the raw, untamed element that her father had so desperately tried to shield her from. Mrs. Gable, her hands busy polishing a silver teapot, noticed Eleanor's fixed gaze. "The rusty spur," she said, her voice flat, "ain't much more than a den of sin and scurrilous behavior. Best steer clear, girl." Eleanor nodded, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She knew she couldn't steer clear forever. Sooner or later, she would have to confront the realities of Redemption Creek, and that meant confronting the forces that governed it, even if they were as rough and uncivilized as the saloon itself. She closed the book, the imagined adventures fading before the stark reality of her own predicament. The loneliness was a tangible thing pressing in on her, but beneath it, the ember of anger began to glow a little brighter. She was in Redemption Creek now, and she would find her own path, however perilous. The days in Redemption Creek began to blur into a monotonous rhythm. Eleanor found work at the general store, her nimble fingers and sharp mind proving valuable in organizing stock and assisting customers. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was a gruff but fair man who appreciated her diligence. The work was hard, the hours long, but it provided her with a much-needed distraction, a sense of purpose that pushed the ghosts of Willow Creek further into the shadows. She learned the names of the townsfolk, the rhythms of their lives, their small triumphs and quiet disappointments. There was Martha, the baker's wife, whose bread was legendary and whose gossip was even more so. Silas, the blacksmith, a man of few words but immense strength, and Sheriff Brody, a man who seemed to embody the very essence of apathy. Sheriff Brody was a large man, whose uniform always seemed a size too small, strained across his considerable belly. He spent most of his days ensconced in his office, a small, dusty room adjacent to the general store, ostensibly keeping the peace. But the peace he kept was a fragile, almost non-existent thing. Eleanor had witnessed him dismiss minor disputes with a wave of his hand, his eyes more often fixed on the poker game unfolding on his desk than on the worried faces of those seeking his help. One sweltering afternoon, a young woman no older than Eleanor burst into the general store, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Henderson, Sheriff Brody, you have to help me." Mr. Henderson looked up from his ledger, his brow furrowed. "What's happened, Sarah?" "It's Jedediah," she sobbed, clutching a torn shawl. He took my ma's medicine, said she wouldn't need it where she was going. Jedediah was a known troublemaker, a drifter who often found himself on the wrong side of the law, yet always seemed to slip through Sheriff Brody's grasp. Eleanor's heart ached for Sarah. She'd seen the fear in her eyes, a fear that mirrored her own when she'd first arrived. Mr. Henderson, his face grim, said, "I'll fetch the sheriff." Sheriff Brody ambled over, his gait slow and unhurried, as if the urgency of the situation was an inconvenience. He listened to Sarah's tearful account with a bored expression, occasionally scratching his chin. "Now, Sarah," he drawled, his voice a low rumble, "you sure he took it? Maybe your ma misplaced it, or maybe Jedediah just borrowed it for a bit." "Borrowed it?" Sarah cried, incredulous. "Sheriff, my ma is sick. That was the last of her fever medicine." Brody sighed, a gust of air that seemed to carry the weight of his disinterest. "Look, girl, I ain't got time for every little squabble. Jedediah's probably halfway to the next town by now. I'll keep an eye out." He turned to leave, the faint aroma of cheap whiskey preceding him. But what about my mother?" Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. Sheriff Brody stopped at the doorway, turning back with an air of weary exasperation. "You want me to chase down every pilferer of patent medicines? This ain't no place for the faint of heart, Sarah. You gotta learn to handle things yourself sometimes." With that, he disappeared into his office, the swinging doors closing with a definitive thud, leaving Sarah weeping and Eleanor fuming. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. She felt a surge of indignant anger, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume her. She looked at Sarah's distraught face, at Mr. Henderson's resigned expression, and then at the closed door of Sheriff Brody's office. This was not justice. This was not protection. This was a blatant abdication of responsibility. "He can't just ignore it," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Mr. Henderson shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "That's Sheriff Brody for you, Eleanor. More interested in his cards than his duties. He's not a bad man, I suppose, just lazy and tired. This town's been too rough for too long. Sometimes it feels like no one's really in charge." Eleanor stared at the saloon across the street, its swinging doors a gaping maw. She saw the men inside, their faces blurred by the distance, their laughter echoing faintly. They were the sort of men Jedediah would associate with, the sort of men who preyed on the weak. And Sheriff Brody, the man sworn to protect them, offered nothing but indifference. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep well. The injustice gnawed at her, a persistent ache that wouldn't recede. She thought of her own helplessness, her own vulnerability, and then a thought, audacious and unexpected, began to form in the darkness. The following week was marked by a growing unease in Redemption Creek. Jedediah, emboldened by Sheriff Brody's inaction, had become more brazen. He'd been seen loitering outside the saloon, harassing women and pilfering small items from unattended stalls. The general sentiment among the townsfolk was one of frustration and fear, a low hum of discontent that Sheriff Brody seemed blissfully unaware of, or perhaps willfully ignored. Eleanor watched it all unfold with a growing sense of dread and a mounting anger. She saw Sarah's mother, frail and weak, clutching a newly purchased bottle of medicine, her eyes hollow with worry. She heard the hushed conversations among the women, their voices laced with apprehension. Redemption Creek was becoming less a place of refuge and more a breeding ground for fear. One evening, as Eleanor walked home from the general store, the sun casting long, mournful shadows, she found herself drawn to the edge of town, where a small, dilapidated cabin stood against the vast prairie. A faint light flickered from within. Curiosity and a sense of unease propelled her forward. She recognized the cabin. It belonged to an elderly woman named Agnes, a recluse known for her quiet nature and her impressive knowledge of medicinal herbs. As Eleanor approached, she heard raised voices. One was Jedediah's rough, drunken bellow. The other, a frail, trembling voice, was Agnes. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. Without a second thought, she broke into a run, her valise banging against her leg. She reached the cabin door and without hesitation threw it open. The scene inside was stark. Jedediah, his face flushed with alcohol and malice, had Agnes backed against a wall, his hand reaching for a small, leather-bound pouch that Agnes clutched protectively. The pouch, Eleanor realized with a jolt, likely contained Agnes's valuable herbs. "Get your hands off her, Jedediah!" Eleanor's voice, though trembling, was sharp and commanding. Jedediah whirled around, startled, his eyes, bleary and unfocused, fixed on Eleanor. A sneer twisted his lips. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. What's it to you, woman? Mind your own damn business." Agnes, seeing Eleanor, managed a weak gasp of relief. "Eleanor, please!" Eleanor stood her ground, positioning herself between Jedediah and Agnes. She was smaller than Jedediah and certainly less imposing, but a steely resolve had settled over her. "This is my business. You will leave this woman and this place immediately." Jedediah let out a harsh laugh. "You think you can tell me what to do? You ain't nobody, just some lost little bird who flew into the wrong nest." He took a step towards her menacingly. Eleanor's mind raced. She had no weapon, no physical strength to match his, but she had her voice, and she had a desperate courage born of helplessness. "If you don't leave, I will fetch Sheriff Brody, and this time," she said, her voice rising, "I will tell him exactly what I saw. You harassing an old woman trying to rob her." Jedediah faltered for a moment. He knew Sheriff Brody was lazy, but a direct accusation, especially from a newcomer, might be enough to stir him. He grumbled, his bravado momentarily deflated. "Fine. But this ain't over, lady." He shoved past Eleanor, stumbling out of the cabin and disappearing into the night. Eleanor immediately turned to Agnes, her hands shaking as she helped the old woman to a chair. "Are you all right, Agnes?" Agnes, her breath still coming in ragged gasps, nodded weakly. "Yes, dear. Thank you. You saved me." Her eyes, rheumy with age, held a deep gratitude. "That pouch," she said, gesturing to it, "contains my remedies. They're all I have left." Eleanor stayed with Agnes for a while, offering her a comforting presence until the old woman's breathing evened out. As she walked back to Mrs. Gable's boarding house, the encounter replayed in her mind. She had stood up to Jedediah. She had protected someone vulnerable, and it had felt good. Not a triumphant good, but a quiet, profound satisfaction. Sheriff Brody's indifference had been a catalyst. Agnes's fear had been a call to action. And Eleanor, the scorned bride, had answered. The spark of defiance that had flickered within her had grown into a steady flame. She realized with a dawning clarity that she wasn't just trying to survive in Redemption Creek. She was starting to fight. The encounter with Jedediah had changed something within Eleanor. The gnawing helplessness that had accompanied her arrival in Redemption Creek began to recede, replaced by a nascent sense of agency. She still worked at the general store, still endured the quiet monotony of her days, but there was a new light in her eyes, a subtle shift in her posture. She no longer felt like a victim, she felt like a survivor. However, the incident with Agnes had also highlighted the glaring absence of effective law enforcement. Sheriff Brody's inaction wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a danger. The town was becoming increasingly lawless, its vulnerability exploited by men like Jedediah. Eleanor found herself observing the sheriff's office more closely. Its door, usually ajar, revealed Brody hunched over cards or hunched over his desk, a picture of indolence. One afternoon, a delegation of townsfolk led by Mr. Henderson decided to confront Sheriff Brody. Eleanor, though hesitant to involve herself directly, watched from the general store's doorway as they entered his office. The conversation, though muffled by distance, grew heated. She saw Mr. Henderson gesturing emphatically, his face flushed with frustration. Sheriff Brody, in contrast, remained seated, his arms crossed, his expression one of weary defiance. Moments later, the group emerged, their faces etched with defeat. "He won't do anything," Mr. Henderson announced, his voice heavy with resignation. "Says it's outside his jurisdiction, or some such nonsense. He claims he's got bigger fish to fry, or maybe he's just protecting his poker game." A wave of murmurs swept through the small crowd. The helplessness was palpable. Eleanor felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was coupled with a desperate resolve. This wasn't just about Agnes anymore. It was about the soul of Redemption Creek. That night, after her shift at the store, Eleanor made a decision. She walked, not towards Mrs. Gable's boarding house, but directly towards the heart of the town's unease, the Rusty Spur Saloon. The swinging doors seemed to beckon her, a gauntlet thrown down. She wasn't going in for a drink, she was going to observe, to understand the enemy, perhaps. Or more accurately, to understand the environment that allowed such men to thrive. She found a shadowed alcove across the street, from which she could see into the saloon's main room. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke, the din of drunken laughter and the clatter of dice. Men, rough and unkempt, were everywhere. The proprietor, a greasy-haired man named Silas, moved among the tables, serving drinks and collecting money. She recognized some of the faces, Jedediah, emboldened and loud, laughing boisterously with a group of equally unsavory characters. She also saw a familiar figure, Sheriff Brody, not behind his desk, but at a table in the back, his eyes fixed on a hand of cards, a half-empty whiskey glass beside him. The sight was both infuriating and disheartening. The town's lawman was not upholding the law. He was participating in the very scene of illicit activity he was supposed to be policing. Eleanor watched as Jedediah, emboldened by alcohol and the sheriff's apparent lack of interest, made a crude remark to a passing woman who quickly hurried away, her face a mask of fear. Eleanor's stomach churned. This was the reality of Redemption Creek, a town where the law was apathetic and the lawless were emboldened. She saw with chilling clarity how deep the rot went. It wasn't just individual bad actors, it was a systemic failure. As she watched, a sudden commotion erupted near the bar. A bar brawl, fueled by drink and old grudges, spilled out into the street. Chairs overturned, glasses shattered, and the air filled with shouts and curses. Sheriff Brody, still at his poker table, merely grunted and dealt another card, oblivious or uncaring. Eleanor knew then and there that waiting for someone else to fix things was a fool's errand. No one was coming to save Redemption Creek. If this town was to be redeemed, if its citizens were to be protected, it would have to be by someone who refused to accept the status quo. As she turned away from the saloon, the night air cool against her flushed face, a single potent thought solidified in her mind. She couldn't rely on Sheriff Brody. She couldn't wait for a savior. If justice was to be served, if safety was to be found, she would have to find a way to bring it herself. The idea was terrifying, audacious, and utterly undeniably necessary. The confrontation at the saloon, though witnessed from a distance, solidified Eleanor's resolve. The image of Sheriff Brody, apathetic and detached, while lawlessness flourished, burned in her mind. She understood, with a clarity that was both frightening and empowering, that the existing power structure in Redemption Creek was broken. The badge, meant to represent authority and protection, had become a symbol of indifference. She started to pay closer attention to the minutiae of the town's governance, or lack thereof. She observed Sheriff Brody's infrequent patrols, his tendency to avoid any situation that might require genuine effort. She noticed how the outlaws and troublemakers seemed to operate with impunity, knowing they could often get away with their transgressions. One evening, she found herself talking to Silas, the blacksmith, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a deep well of observation. He was hammering a horseshoe with powerful rhythmic blows, the sparks flying with each strike. "Silas," Eleanor began, her voice gentle, "I've been noticing things about Sheriff Brody." Silas paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. He met her gaze, his eyes clear and steady. "He's a good man, Eleanor, in his own way. Just tired. This town wears a man down. He's seen too much, too often, and nothing ever seems to change. But that's the problem, isn't it?" Eleanor pressed, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. "If nothing changes, if no one tries, then it'll only get worse. People like Jedediah will run roughshod over everyone." Silas resumed his hammering, a thoughtful rhythm accompanying his words. "Change ain't easy, Eleanor, especially out here. Takes more than just wanting it. Takes grit. Takes someone willing to do the dirty work." His words resonated deeply with her. Dirty work. Was she willing to do the dirty work? The thought was daunting. She was just a woman who had been abandoned, who worked in a general store. What could she possibly do? Then an idea, born from desperation and a burgeoning sense of responsibility, began to take shape. It was a radical idea, one that defied convention and challenged the very foundations of what a woman in the West was supposed to be. But the more she considered it, the more it felt like the only logical course of action. The next day, Eleanor approached Sheriff Brody's office with a determined stride. The door was, as usual, slightly ajar. Sheriff Brody was there, slumped in his chair, a newspaper obscuring his face. "Sheriff Brody," Eleanor announced, her voice clear and steady. Brody lowered the newspaper, his eyes blinking in surprise. "Eleanor, what can I do for you?" Eleanor walked into the office, her gaze sweeping over the cluttered desk, the empty whiskey bottles, the faint smell of stale tobacco. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I've come to speak to you about your position." Brody frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "My position? What about it?" "It's clear you're unsuited for it, Sheriff," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. "This town needs a leader, someone who will protect its citizens, not ignore them, someone who isn't afraid to do the work." Brody's eyes narrowed. He stood up, his bulk filling the small office. "And who do you think you are, lady, telling me this?" "I'm a citizen of Redemption Creek," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "And I see that the badge you wear isn't being used to uphold justice. It's being used as a shield against responsibility." Brody's face darkened. "You think you can do better?" he challenged, a sneer in his voice. "You think you can wear this badge and handle the rough and tumble of this town?" Eleanor met his challenge, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshakable. "I believe I can try. I believe I can do better. If you are unwilling or unable to fulfill your duties, then perhaps it's time for someone else to step forward. She saw a flicker of something in Brody's eyes. Surprise, perhaps even a grudging respect buried beneath his defensiveness. He scoffed, but the usual bluster was missing. "You're a fool, woman. A complete fool." He looked away toward the window, as if seeking an escape from the unexpected confrontation. Eleanor didn't push further that day. She simply left the office, her mind buzzing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had planted the seed. Now she had to wait and see if it would take root. The weight of her decision, the sheer audacity of it, settled upon her, but it was a weight she felt ready to bear. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and skepticism, but for the first time since arriving in Redemption Creek, Eleanor Vance felt a true sense of purpose. Sheriff Brody, it turned out, was more than just lazy. He was also proud. Eleanor's direct challenge had stung him, and the ensuing conversations she'd subtly initiated among the townsfolk, questioning his efficacy, had done the rest. While no one openly sided against the sheriff, a palpable undercurrent of discontent had begun to surface. The townspeople, accustomed to his neglect, were now faced with the uncomfortable reality that perhaps a change was needed, even if they couldn't articulate it or didn't know how to instigate it. The following week, a series of small incidents, seemingly minor on their own, began to chip away at Brody's authority. A shipment of goods went missing from the railway depot, an act of petty theft that Brody dismissed as transient problem. A dispute over water rights between two ranchers escalated, and Brody, instead of mediating, declared it a matter for the courts, which, in Redemption Creek, meant it would likely never be resolved. Each instance, amplified by Eleanor's quiet but persistent observations and conversations, fueled the growing sentiment that the sheriff was failing his duty. One sweltering afternoon, as Eleanor was arranging tins of beans at the general store, Sheriff Brody himself appeared at the doorway. He looked different. His usual air of bored indifference was replaced by a troubled furrow in his brow. He seemed uncomfortable, almost sheepish. "Eleanor," he began, his voice lower than usual, "we need to talk." Eleanor straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt a surge of anticipation, a potent mix of hope and trepidation. "About what, Sheriff?" Brody stepped inside, looking around as if expecting to see accusations in the canned goods. "About this town. About me. You were right in a way. I'm tired. This town, it's a tough place, and maybe I've gotten complacent." He sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weariness of years. "The truth is, I don't know if I can handle it anymore. Not the way it needs to be handled." Eleanor's heart gave a strange lurch. This was it, the moment she had both dreaded and anticipated. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" I'm considering stepping down," he admitted, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "But the thought of just walking away, leaving this place to the wolves, it ain't right. And the thought of you, a woman, taking up this fight, it's a lot." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "This badge, Eleanor, it's heavy. It attracts trouble. It makes you a target. Are you sure you're ready for that? Are you sure you understand what you're asking for?" Eleanor met his gaze, her own eyes steady. She saw not just Brody's weariness, but the genuine concern for the town, a flicker of the man he might have been. "I understand it won't be easy, Sheriff. I understand there will be danger, but I also understand that doing nothing is a greater danger. This town deserves a chance, and I believe, with the right support, I can give it that chance." Brody was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant clang of Silas's hammer. He seemed to be weighing her words, measuring her conviction. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Eleanor. All right. If you're truly set on this, I'll make it official. I'll go to the mayor, tell him I'm resigning, and I'll tell him I think you should be the one to take my place." The weight of his words settled upon Eleanor like a physical burden. She had asked for change, and change was coming, whether she was truly ready or not. The idea of wearing the badge, of holding the authority and responsibility that had so clearly crushed Sheriff Brody, was overwhelming. The whispers in the saloon, the scorn she had endured, these were minor annoyances compared to the immense challenge that lay before her. But as she looked at Brody, at the quiet desperation in his eyes, she knew she couldn't back down. She had ignited a spark, and now it was her responsibility to fan it into a flame. The announcement rippled through Redemption Creek like a sudden storm. Sheriff Brody was resigning, effective immediately, and his successor, the one he himself had put forward, was Eleanor Vance. The general store, usually a hub of quiet commerce, buzzed with astonished whispers. "Eleanor? But she's just a woman. She's new in town. What does she know about law and order?" Jedediah will have a field day with this. The skepticism was loud, palpable. Eleanor, serving customers with a forced calm, felt the weight of their stares, their unspoken doubts. She saw the fear in some eyes, the derision in others. But beneath the surface, she also detected a flicker of something else, a desperate hope. The hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this unconventional choice might be the catalyst for change they all secretly yearned for. Sheriff Brody formally handed over his badge to Eleanor that same afternoon. It was a simple ceremony, held outside his office, with a small, bewildered crowd watching. The badge, a worn piece of polished metal, felt surprisingly heavy in Eleanor's hand. It wasn't just metal. It was a symbol of trust, of authority, and of a profound responsibility. Brody looked at her, a mixture of relief and apprehension in his eyes. "It's yours now, Eleanor. May it serve this town better than it served me." As Brody walked away, the town's silence descended, thick and expectant. Eleanor, the new sheriff of Redemption Creek, stood alone. The weight of the badge, a constant reminder of the daunting task ahead. Her first official act was to declare the sheriff's office open to all, not just for official business, but for any citizen needing a safe space, a listening ear. She began by cleaning the office herself, scrubbing away the grime, the stale smell of whiskey and neglect. She replaced the worn playing cards with a fresh ledger and a quill. Her initial days were a whirlwind of learning. She pored over Sheriff Brody's meager records, trying to understand the town's legal history, its ongoing disputes, its chronic problems. She spoke with Mr. Henderson, gaining insights into the town's economic pulse. She visited Agnes, thanking her for her quiet strength and seeking her wisdom on the town's ailments, both physical and social. The true test, however, came sooner than expected. Jedediah, true to his word, saw Eleanor's appointment as an opportunity. He swaggered into town, a smirk plastered on his face, clearly expecting to find a weak, easily intimidated sheriff. He found Eleanor standing outside her newly cleaned office, her gaze unwavering. "Well, well," Jedediah sneered, approaching her. "Looks like they finally found someone to hand the badge to. Didn't expect it to be a woman, though. This town's gone soft." Eleanor held his gaze. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture or threaten. "Jedediah," she said, her voice calm and firm, "you are no longer welcome to harass the citizens of Redemption Creek. You will conduct yourself with respect, or you will face the consequences." Jedediah let out a loud, derisive laugh. "Consequences? What consequences are you going to give me, little lady? You going to send me to my room?" He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. Eleanor didn't flinch. She reached for the sheriff's badge pinned to her simple dress. "The consequence, Jedediah," she said, her voice hardening, "is that I am the sheriff now, and I will uphold the law." She then reached into her satchel, producing a small but sturdy wooden club that Sheriff Brody had left behind. "Now I suggest you leave town, before I have to escort you." Jedediah's eyes narrowed, surprised by her lack of fear. He saw the steely resolve in her expression, the quiet determination that belied her gender. He saw the townsfolk peeking from behind curtains and doorways, their faces no longer filled with passive resignation, but with a cautious curiosity. He was accustomed to a sheriff who ignored him, not one who actively confronted him. For the first time, Jedediah felt a flicker of uncertainty. He mumbled a curse, turned on his heel, and walked away, a begrudging respect, or perhaps just a newfound caution, in his step. Eleanor watched him go, her heart pounding but a sense of triumph, quiet and profound, settling within her. The first battle had been won. The departure of Jedediah, though a significant victory, was only the beginning. Eleanor understood that winning the respect of the townspeople would require more than just standing up to a single troublemaker. It would require consistent action, unwavering integrity, and a deep commitment to justice. Her days were long, filled with the mundane tasks of law enforcement, mediating disputes, investigating petty thefts, and ensuring the peace. But she approached each task with a seriousness and dedication that had been absent for years. She made it a point to visit every business, every household, not just to address complaints, but to listen. She learned about the struggles of the ranchers, the anxieties of the shopkeepers, the quiet desperation of those living on the fringes. She recognized that true leadership wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about understanding the needs of the community and working to address them. One of the most pressing issues was the ongoing threat of outlaws who used Redemption Creek as a staging ground for their raids on nearby settlements. Sheriff Brody had done little to curb this, often turning a blind eye, believing it was too dangerous to confront such men. Eleanor knew she couldn't afford that luxury. She began by strengthening the town's watch. She organized a small, dedicated group of citizens, including Silas the blacksmith, and a few other reliable men who were willing to patrol the town's perimeter and report any suspicious activity. She also implemented a system for quick communication, ensuring that any threat could be relayed to her office immediately. Her resolve was tested again when a group of bandits, notorious for their cruelty, rode into a neighboring town, robbing the bank and leaving a trail of destruction. The fear that such acts instilled spread like wildfire. Many in Redemption Creek looked to Eleanor with trepidation, expecting her to declare it too dangerous, to retreat behind her office doors. Instead, Eleanor gathered her newly formed town watch. "These men prey on fear," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "They rely on the fact that people are too afraid to stand against them. We will not give them that satisfaction. We will be vigilant. We will be prepared." She met with the leaders of the affected neighboring towns, offering what little assistance Redemption Creek could provide: intelligence, supplies, and a promise of mutual support. She was building alliances, fostering a sense of unity that had been absent for too long. Her approach wasn't just about force, it was about intelligence and strategy. She spent hours studying the known routes of these outlaw gangs, piecing together information from travelers and her growing network of informants. She understood that prevention was more effective than reaction. The townsfolk began to notice the change. The constant fear that had hung over Redemption Creek started to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of security. They saw Eleanor's dedication, her fairness, her willingness to put herself on the line. They saw her treating everyone with respect, from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest drifter, as long as they abided by the law. One evening, as Eleanor sat in her office, poring over a map, Mr. Henderson stopped by. He brought her a fresh pot of coffee, a gesture of appreciation. "Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with a warmth she hadn't heard before, "you're doing good work, real good work. This town, it needed this. It needed you." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. The weight of the badge was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a purpose. She was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the abandoned bride. She was Sheriff Vance, the protector of Redemption Creek. The foundation was being laid, brick by painstaking brick, and for the first time, the future of the town and her place within it seemed not just possible, but promising. The relative peace Eleanor had cultivated in Redemption Creek was a fragile thing, like a desert flower clinging to life in arid soil. She had proven herself capable, and a grudging respect was beginning to bloom among the townsfolk. But the West was a land of shifting sands, and threats often emerged from the most unexpected places. The whispers about the outlaw gang, the Dust Devils, who had been terrorizing the region, grew louder and more insistent. They were known for their ruthlessness, their brazen raids, and their uncanny ability to disappear into the vast, unforgiving landscape. Eleanor knew these were not men to be underestimated. She had expanded her network, gathering intelligence from weary travelers and nervous merchants. She learned that the Dust Devils, led by a notorious and cold-blooded killer named Silas "Snake" Morgan, were becoming increasingly bold, their targets moving closer to Redemption Creek. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. One evening, as Eleanor was reviewing her notes, Silas, the blacksmith, entered her office, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sheriff," he said, his voice grave, "word is the Dust Devils are planning something big. They say they've got their sights set on the stagecoach carrying the month's payroll to the new mine." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The payroll was substantial, and if the Dust Devils got their hands on it, it would not only enrich them, but also cripple the nascent development of the mine, the very lifeblood of Redemption Creek's future prosperity. "When?" she asked, her voice tight. "Tomorrow," Silas replied grimly, "just after dawn. It's the usual route through Coyote Pass." Coyote Pass. A narrow, winding trail notorious for its treacherous terrain and blind corners. It was the perfect ambush point. Eleanor knew that a direct confrontation with the Dust Devils, a gang of seasoned and hardened criminals, would be suicidal for her small, inexperienced force. But to do nothing was to invite disaster. She called an immediate meeting of her watchmen, Silas, Mr. Henderson, and a few other stout-hearted men. The atmosphere in the makeshift command center, crammed into Eleanor's small office, was tense. "We can't let them take that payroll," Eleanor stated, her voice firm, cutting through the anxious murmurs. "If they succeed, the mine will close and this town will wither and die. We have to stop them." "But, Sheriff," Mr. Henderson interjected, his face pale, "there are at least a dozen of them. We're barely a handful. It's madness." "Madness is letting them succeed," Eleanor retorted, her eyes scanning their worried faces. "We won't meet them head-on. We'll use the terrain to our advantage. We'll set a trap." She outlined her plan. It was audacious, relying on misdirection and a well-timed ambush. They would position themselves at a vantage point overlooking Coyote Pass, using the natural cover of the rocks. When the stagecoach approached, they would create a diversion, drawing the Dust Devils into a predetermined kill zone, where Silas and his men would be waiting with their rifles. The key was precision, timing, and absolute silence until the moment of attack. Despite their fear, the men agreed. They trusted Eleanor's leadership, her unwavering resolve. As they dispersed to prepare, Eleanor felt the immense weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders. She was no longer just the protector of Redemption Creek. She was its last line of defense against a brutal tide of lawlessness. As the first slivers of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Eleanor, armed with her resolve and a steady hand on her pistol, rode out towards Coyote Pass, the fate of Redemption Creek resting precariously in her hands. The air in Coyote Pass was cold and still, the pre-dawn light painting the rugged landscape in shades of grey and deep indigo. Eleanor and her small band of watchmen were concealed amongst the jagged rocks, their breath misting in the frigid air. Every rustle of wind, every dislodged pebble seemed amplified, each sound a potential harbinger of doom. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. She gripped her rifle, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the winding trail below. The stagecoach was due any moment. The payroll destined for the new mine represented more than just money. It represented hope, progress, and the future of Redemption Creek. If Silas Snake Morgan and his dust devils got their hands on it, all of that would be extinguished. Eleanor had spent hours studying the terrain, envisioning the ambush, and now the moment of truth had arrived. A distant rumble, growing steadily louder, announced the approaching stagecoach. Eleanor signaled to her men, a silent, urgent gesture. They settled deeper into their hiding places, their rifles loaded and ready. As the stagecoach rounded a bend, its horses straining against the ascent, a dark, menacing shadow fell across the trail. 4 riders, their faces masked by bandanas, emerged from the scrub, their rifles leveled. The dust devils. "Hold it right there!" Snake Morgan's voice, harsh and gravelly, echoed through the pass. "Hand over the strongbox, and nobody gets hurt." The driver, a grizzled man named Jeb, pulled the horses to a halt, his hands raised. Eleanor watched as one of the bandits dismounted, swaggering towards the stagecoach. This was the signal. Eleanor raised her rifle, took aim at a precariously balanced pile of rocks 100 yards up the pass, and fired. The shot cracked through the stillness, followed by a thunderous cascade of falling stones. The diversion worked perfectly. The bandits, startled, looked up towards the rockslide, their attention momentarily diverted. "What the devil?" one of them shouted. "Ambush!" another yelled. It was the moment they had been waiting for. From their hidden positions, Eleanor and her men opened fire. The pass erupted in a maelstrom of lead and dust. Silas, positioned with his riflemen on the opposite ridge, unleashed a volley that caught the bandits by surprise. Snake Morgan, caught off guard, whirled around, his eyes blazing with fury. He recognized Eleanor immediately, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. "It's the woman!" he roared, his voice laced with disbelief and rage. Chaos ensued. The bandits, their ambush plans shattered, scrambled for cover, returning fire wildly. Eleanor, moving with a speed and precision that surprised even herself, directed her men, picking off targets with calculated shots. She saw Silas Snake Morgan draw his pistol, aiming it towards the stagecoach, his eyes burning with a murderous intent. He was trying to take Jeb hostage, to use him as a shield. "No!" Eleanor cried, her own pistol steady in her hand. She fired, aiming for Morgan's gun hand. The shot was true. Morgan yelped in pain, dropping his pistol. His men, seeing their leader incapacitated and outmatched, began to falter. They were used to overwhelming their opponents, not facing a coordinated and determined defense. Within minutes, the remaining dust devils, demoralized and outmaneuvered, turned and fled, disappearing into the rugged terrain as quickly as they had appeared. The pass fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of Eleanor and her men, and the terrified whinnying of the stagecoach horses. Eleanor lowered her rifle, her body trembling with the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. They had done it. They had defended Redemption Creek. The aftermath of the ambush in Coyote Pass was a turning point for Redemption Creek. Eleanor Vance, the scorned bride who had dared to take the sheriff's badge, was no longer an outsider or an object of ridicule. She was their protector, the woman who had faced down the notorious dust devils and saved the town from ruin. The fear that had once permeated their lives began to recede, replaced by a powerful surge of unity and pride. As Eleanor and her men, along with the shaken but unharmed stagecoach driver, returned to town, they were met not with skepticism, but with cheers. The townsfolk, who had gathered anxiously at the general store and sheriff's office, rushed out to greet them. Mr. Henderson, his face beaming, clasped Eleanor's hand. "You did it, Sheriff! You actually did it!" Silas, the blacksmith, his usual stoicism replaced by a broad grin, clapped Eleanor on the shoulder. "Never doubted you for a moment, Sheriff. Never doubted you." Even Sheriff Brody, who had lingered in town, his resignation officially submitted but his departure delayed, watched from a distance, a look of stunned admiration on his weathered face. He had underestimated her, and in doing so had witnessed a transformation he could only have dreamed of orchestrating. The payroll was secured, and the mine's operations continued, a symbol of Redemption Creek's resilience and burgeoning future. Eleanor, however, knew that the victory was not an end, but a beginning. The Dust Devils were still out there, wounded but not defeated, and Silas "Snake" Morgan would undoubtedly seek revenge. She couldn't afford to become complacent. She used the newfound respect and trust to solidify her authority and implement further improvements. She established a more robust town watch, recruiting more men and providing them with better training and equipment. She worked with the town council to allocate funds for reinforcing the sheriff's office, turning it from a symbol of neglect into a functional headquarters. She even began to train some of the younger men in basic law enforcement, ensuring that there would be a capable hand to guide Redemption Creek in the future. Eleanor also recognized the importance of addressing the root causes of crime and desperation. She worked to create more opportunities within the town, supporting local businesses and encouraging new ventures. She established a small community fund, drawn from a portion of the confiscated Dust Devil loot, to help families in need, ensuring that no one in Redemption Creek was left to suffer the same kind of abandonment she had experienced. Her empathy became her greatest strength. She listened to the grievances of the townsfolk with genuine care, mediating disputes with fairness and a deep understanding of human nature. She didn't just enforce the law, she fostered a sense of community, of shared responsibility. The Rusty Spur Saloon, once the epitome of Redemption Creek's lawlessness, saw a noticeable decline in its disruptive clientele. Eleanor's presence and the town's newfound sense of order made it a less appealing haven for troublemakers. One evening, sitting in her office, the ledger open before her, Eleanor reflected on how far she had come. The loneliness that had defined her arrival was still a faint echo, but it was now overshadowed by a sense of belonging, of purpose. She was no longer the scorned bride. She was Sheriff Vance, a leader, a protector, a woman who had forged her own destiny in the heart of the unforgiving West. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but she faced it not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place and her strength in the most unexpected of circumstances. The victory at Coyote Pass had brought a fragile peace to Redemption Creek, but Eleanor knew that Silas "Snake" Morgan was not a man to forgive and forget. The humiliation of his defeat and the loss of the payroll would fester in his vengeful heart. She continued to strengthen her defenses, reinforcing the town's watch and gathering intelligence, but the question of when he would strike again loomed like a persistent storm cloud. Her efforts were not unnoticed. Mr. Henderson brought her reports from travelers who spoke of Morgan regrouping his forces, his anger fueling his resolve. Silas the blacksmith worked tirelessly, crafting sturdier locks for the jail and reinforcing the doors of key buildings. The townsfolk, though still wary, now approached Eleanor with a sense of trust and cooperation. They understood that their safety depended on her vigilance. One crisp autumn evening, as the wind howled through the skeletal branches of the prairie trees, a lone rider galloped into town, his horse lathered and his face etched with panic. He was a ranch hand from a spread several miles east of Redemption Creek. "Sheriff! Sheriff Vance!" he cried, dismounting clumsily. "It's Snake Morgan!" He and his men, they raided the Double R Ranch. They burned the barn, stole the horses, and they took Jedediah. The mention of Jedediah, the drifter Eleanor had confronted in her early days, was a strange twist. He had been a nuisance, but not a hardened criminal. Why would Morgan want him? Eleanor's mind raced. Perhaps Jedediah had information about the town, or perhaps Morgan was simply using him as a pawn. Did they hurt anyone? Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp with concern. "Old man Hemlock, he tried to fight back. They shot him. They said they're coming back for Redemption Creek, said they're coming to take what's theirs." The ranch hand's voice cracked with fear. The threat was chillingly direct. Morgan, humiliated and enraged, was escalating his campaign of terror. He was not just after money, he was after retribution. Eleanor knew that this was no longer about a payroll or a small gang. This was a direct assault on everything she had worked to build. She immediately gathered Silas, Mr. Henderson, and the town watch. The news of the Double R Ranch raid had already spread like wildfire, and the faces of the townsfolk were grim. This was no longer a distant threat. It was at their doorstep. "Morgan is playing a dangerous game," Eleanor stated, her voice resonating with grim determination. "He thinks he can break us, shatter our resolve. But he's mistaken. We stood against him before, and we will stand against him again." Silas, his hammer resting on his shoulder, nodded grimly. "We're ready, Sheriff, whatever it takes." Eleanor, however, knew that a direct defense of the town would be costly. Morgan's men were seasoned killers, and a pitched battle within the town limits could lead to devastating casualties among the innocent. She needed a plan, a strategy that would neutralize Morgan and his gang without sacrificing the lives of her people. "We can't let them breach the town," Eleanor said, pacing the small office. "But we also can't afford to lose lives in a street fight. We need to draw them out. We need to make them come to us, on our terms." She looked at the map of Redemption Creek, her gaze sharp and focused. The mine, with its network of tunnels, offered a potential strategic advantage. It was dangerous, but it was also their best chance. A risky plan began to form in her mind, a plan that would require courage, cunning, and a deep understanding of her enemy. She knew that this would be her greatest test yet, a confrontation that would define not only her leadership, but the very survival of Redemption Creek. The shadow of revenge had fallen, and Eleanor Vance was ready to meet it. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless, but Eleanor believed it was Redemption Creek's only hope. Silas "Snake" Morgan, fueled by a thirst for revenge, was undoubtedly planning a direct assault on the town. Eleanor, however, aimed to lure him into a trap, not in the dusty streets, but deep within the labyrinthine tunnels of the new mine. The mine, a symbol of the town's burgeoning prosperity, would become the battleground for its survival. Eleanor dispatched Silas and a small, trusted team to set up a series of strategic barricades and traps within the mine's main shafts. They worked through the night, their movements silent and swift, transforming the dark, echoing tunnels into a potential death trap. Mr. Henderson, using his influence, began subtly spreading rumors through the surrounding territories. Rumors of a massive payroll being transported and stored within the mine, a treasure trove waiting to be plundered. The bait was set. Eleanor herself, along with a few of her most capable watchmen, prepared to act as decoys, drawing Morgan's attention towards the mine entrance. She knew the risks were immense. If Morgan saw through their deception, or if his men were too numerous or too brutal, they would be trapped deep underground with no hope of escape. The tension in Redemption Creek was palpable. The townsfolk, armed and ready, were instructed to remain in their homes, to barricade their doors, and to await Eleanor's signal. The fate of their town now rested on a daring gamble. As dawn broke, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Snake Morgan and his gang, their numbers swelled by desperation and greed, were riding towards Redemption Creek. Eleanor, mounted on her sturdy mare, watched them approach from a vantage point overlooking the mine entrance. Beside her, Silas the blacksmith, his rifle held steady, offered a silent nod of reassurance. "They're taking the bait," Silas murmured, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding. "Let's move. We need to make sure they see us heading into the mine." With a small contingent of men, Eleanor rode towards the mine entrance, making sure their movements were visible to the approaching bandits. Morgan, seeing them, grinned, his cruel eyes glinting with anticipation. He saw not a determined sheriff preparing for a defense, but a cornered animal making a last desperate stand. "Look at 'em!" Morgan spat to his men, his voice laced with contempt. "Hiding in that hole in the ground like rats. Think they can stop us? We'll flush 'em out, and then we'll take everything they've got." The dust devils, emboldened by Morgan's confidence, charged towards the mine entrance, their war cries echoing through the canyon. Eleanor and her small group retreated into the darkness of the mine, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind them. The sounds of the bandits' approach, their heavy boots on the mine floor, their rough shouts, reverberated through the tunnels, growing closer and closer. Eleanor positioned her small team near the first major junction, their rifles ready. She knew that the success of the entire plan depended on drawing Morgan and the bulk of his men deeper into the mine, towards the preset traps. As the first of the bandits appeared in the flickering lamplight, Eleanor gave the signal. The ambush had begun. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows within the mine, transforming the rough-hewn tunnels into a disorienting maze. Eleanor and her small group, armed and resolute, were deep within the earth, the sounds of Snake Morgan's gang echoing ominously around them. The initial volleys of gunfire had erupted moments before, a cacophony of cracks and ricochets that filled the confined space. Silas's traps, a series of strategically placed rockfalls and reinforced tunnel collapses, had begun to work their grim magic, separating Morgan's men, sowing confusion, and slowing their advance. Snake Morgan, however, was not a man easily deterred. Enraged by the resistance and the unexpected effectiveness of Eleanor's tactics, he pressed on, his focus solely on reaching the sheriff and the supposed payroll. He was a predator, and he could smell blood, or at least the scent of perceived victory. Eleanor, her heart pounding, knew that the decisive confrontation had to happen soon. The mine was a death trap for all of them, and her own men were running low on ammunition. She had to lure Morgan into the deepest, most unstable section of the mine, where Silas had prepared his final, most dangerous trap. "We need to draw him further in," Eleanor whispered to Silas, her voice hoarse. "He's too close to the entrance." Silas nodded, his face grim in the lamplight. "He's a stubborn one, Sheriff, but this tunnel, it's ready." He indicated a narrow, unreinforced shaft that branched off from the main passage. It was a section that had been deemed too unstable for regular mining. With a calculated risk, Eleanor ordered a strategic retreat, leaving a trail of dropped supplies and deliberately loud footsteps to guide Morgan. The bait was too tempting for the outlaw leader. He pushed his remaining men forward, their greed overriding their caution. As Morgan and his closest followers advanced into the treacherous shaft, Silas, stationed at a predetermined point, triggered a carefully placed charge. The earth rumbled, and a deafening roar echoed through the tunnels. Rocks and debris rained down, sealing the passage behind Morgan's advance and plunging the immediate area into darkness and chaos. Eleanor, positioned with her remaining men near a secondary exit, could hear the muffled shouts of Morgan and his men, trapped and disoriented. The sounds of panic and desperation began to replace the shouts of aggression. "It's done," Silas said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "They're trapped." Eleanor knew that the immediate threat was neutralized, but the danger wasn't entirely over. She ordered her men to secure the mine entrance and to notify the townsfolk that the immediate danger had passed. Then, carefully, they made their way towards the sealed section, their lanterns casting an eerie glow on the scene. They found Snake Morgan and the few men who had been with him near the collapse. Morgan, battered and disoriented, was pinned beneath a heavy timber, his leg clearly broken. His remaining men, terrified and demoralized, surrendered without a fight. Eleanor looked at the defeated outlaw, no longer a fearsome predator, but a broken man, his reign of terror finally over. "It's over, Morgan," Eleanor said, her voice firm but devoid of triumph. "Your reign of fear ends here. You will face justice." The capture of Snake Morgan and the remnants of the Dust Devils sent a wave of elation through Redemption Creek. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces etched with relief and gratitude. They had faced their greatest fear and had emerged victorious, not through luck, but through courage, determination, and unified action, all led by their unlikely sheriff. In the days that followed, the captured bandits were tried and sentenced. The payroll was recovered, securing the future of the mine and the prosperity of Redemption Creek. Eleanor Vance, no longer the scorned bride, stood tall as the undisputed sheriff, her authority earned through courage and commitment. The scars of the past remained, but they were now interwoven with the dawn of a new era for Redemption Creek, an era of safety, justice, and enduring hope, all born from the resilience of a woman who dared to take the badge.